Hello and welcome to another round of webinar from Inkworks Consulting. Here we're going to be chatting about Nintex to Power Automate and specifically state machines. So how state machines in Nintex, how we can rebuild them with Power Automate systems is going to be the focus of today. And let me get my presentation together. Here we go. So Nintex to Power Automate state machines. A little bit about myself. My name is McCaslin Hughes. Everybody calls me Mac. I am a father and husband. There's my wife, Anna, and our son, Rowan. We live in North Carolina. And outside of work, I'm an avid tennis player, enjoy snowboarding and reading. And at Inkworks Consulting, I am the lead solutions engineer for the Power Platform. And really excited to dive into the topic with this group today. So today, our agenda is we're going to first uncover what is a state machine, and then what are the challenges in converting open up a built solution, look at the SharePoint architecture and what makes that solution work, and then look into the Power Automate system and how we at Inkworks like to construct or rebuild these state machines for our clients in using some best practice and patterns that we've uncovered over the years in our rebuilds. So what is a state machine? It is, at a high level, it's a workflow structure that transitions through different stages for a specific SharePoint item. It can host an item in a stage in the Nintex workflow for however long it needs to. The workflow can last for months or even years. It can remain open in a single state, and until all the parameters of that state have been completed, it will stay there. But then once the inputs have been provided, it can move into another state, or it can end the workflow. It's a state dynamic machine, so it just can continue looping through states until something's been finally completed. Common use cases for a state machine could be, multi-departmental reviews. We've got some looping approval processes. If you have a form that's dynamic and has fields dependent on the current stage or status of the form, you could use a state machine to manage that conditional field visibility. Today, we're going to be looking through an approval process. And so our approval process today is very simple. It follows the pattern that you see in front of you. It starts with a new item being created, and that item will be routed to a pending field tech stage or status. And the field tech will have the option to either approve, which would then send it to the project manager, or they can cancel that request. Once it's in the project manager's hands, they can reject it, send it back to the field tech, or approve it, send it to the executive. Executive can reject it, send it to the PM, or send it forward as a fully approved item. Very simple approach. There are a million ways to do approval processes in Power Automate. This is really just one of them, and it's really in support of those state machine rebuilds. So we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how this works in Power Automate too. And first, I want to show a high-level overview of what the Power Automate flow is going to look like. So the flow is going to have a trigger condition that is going to check for a change in the SharePoint status column. If the SharePoint status column has changed and it equals the right parameter, then we're going to move the flow on, and the next state will be initializing all of our variables that we're going to use throughout the flow. And then we're going to set up some approval data, so like who the approver is, what their approval options are, things like that. And then we're going to send the approval, and we will sit and wait for the approver to respond. Then we'll capture that response and determine what kind of update we want to make on the item. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get right over into our SharePoint. So let's take a look at the architecture of the system. And for this demo today, we have two SharePoint lists that we're going to be using. We have our primary list, which is our approvals list, and it's really simple 4-column SharePoint list. We just have a title, a status choice column, we have a system status text column, and then approval history multi-line text column. And I'll break down what the purpose is for all of these right now. So if we look at our status choice column, this is going to be the active ongoing status of the record. So this record, test number 11, is actively in the status of pending project manager. That's its current status. The system status, and that's actually, let's look into the edit. Let's go ahead and edit this so we can take a look at what's going on here. So this is just a choice column. It's a single select choice column. They can't select multiple. It has a few options, and they've got the nice coloring. And we like to, when we're creating columns, indicate the data type of that column, which stores this as its internal value. So if I look at the list settings, and if I go to status choice, we can see here the internal column name for this is status choice. It doesn't have any, weird characters or spacing issues. It's just a single word. We didn't include any spaces in the name, so it comes off very cleanly, and we are told the type of column it is. And from here we could change it, and it won't impact the internal name. But that's how we like to keep our code a bit cleaner as we're building out the architecture. So that is the choice column. The next column is the status SLT. So this is really a system column. SYS is short for system, and this indicates to the Power Automate flow the previous status of this record. So what has this been transitioned into? What was the last status of the record? And if the flow is going to check if this sys status column is not equal to the status choice column. If they're not the same, then it's going to trigger the flow, and the flow is going to go ahead and run. And then finally, we have our approval history multi-line text column. And so this is sort of a system column. It's not a column that we want users interacting with directly, but their comments that they provide within their approval responses and their approval responses themselves, the outcome, they get appended to this growing record of approval history items. So we can see this item here, it's gone through a few stages of approvals. We can see one after the other. It has the approver name, their approval response, the date and time of their response, and then their comment. And we'll look at what the actual formula is that populates that. But that is our primary table architecture for our approvals. This is where we're tracking our approvals. This is where new requests can be made. And this is how they're actively tracked and managed. Then if we look into a supporting column or a supporting list, we have, this is workflow roles, where we're identifying, for each different approving group, who are the people that are a part of that group that should be sent the approvals. And within the demo we're doing, we've got 3 different groups. We have field tech, project manager, and executive. And we have, for each one, they have a multi-select person column. So you could, that's how this is constructed here. This people column that we've added is a multiple selection person column. And you could have any number of people in here. And how this works is that this person in the field tech record is always going to be the field tech for every single approval request that's submitted. Alternatively, if you wanted to make this more dynamic, if your business required it to be, on a per request basis, you could add a field tech column into your approval list, or you could even build out the workflow roles list even further. If it was more regionally dependent, each region had their own field tech, you could add a column for region and then have the field tech column and people, and you could filter on the region. And you can make this a lot more advanced. This is really a template for jumping off into, a much more advanced style of managing these stage-gated actions and processes, similar to a Nintex state machine would. So on the architecture side, that's really what we're looking at here. That's kind of the highest level of SharePoint architecture needed to support a system like this. And even the workflow roles isn't necessarily required to manage this. But now we can go ahead and move on over into our flow. So a couple things about this system. It is built inside of a solution. So we have our solution. Our solution has a flow. It has some environment variables that we're referencing. It has then 2 connection references. And this is just about as clean as it could get for solution objects. We, are keeping things very condensed down. We're not, we don't have 3 connection references to SharePoint. We have a single connection reference to SharePoint, and we're using it in our approval, in our flow. And then we have 1 connection reference to approvals, and we're using that in our flow. This is really an important thing to consider when managing objects within solutions in the Power Platform. Just use what's required and have as few connection references as possible to keep your source control clean, keep your content clean in your solution. Then we have our environment variables that point to our SharePoint lists, and then we have our flow. So let's go ahead and just dive right into our flow. I'm going to go ahead and open this in a new tab. And again, I want to show the high-level view of this flow. So let me just power through this here. So high level, just reiterating, this is when the status does not equal the sysstatus. So we kind of covered what both of those are intended for. Then we're going to capture our variables in our flow. We're going to initialize all of our variables. We're going to set up our approval data, and that will eventually route approvals to specific approver groups in the send approval action. And then we're going to collect our approval response, and we're going to update our item. So that's the high level. Looking then into the flow, let's see how this works in action. So here is our trigger. Our trigger is whenever an item is created or modified. So we're checking for any change on the record. We want to potentially trigger this workflow, but we don't actually want to trigger it every time something's created or modified. That would be just a lot of API calls to SharePoint. We want to limit our API calling to SharePoint. So within the settings, we have a trigger condition that's checking on if the status choice column, if the value of that choice column is equal to the system status column. And if they are not equal, then this flow will run. If they're different, if the status choice value is different than the system status, then this flow is going to run, and that's what we want. If they're the same, this flow doesn't run, it never triggers, and it just won't run. We want that. We want the flow to only trigger when we want it to run. Trigger conditions are very helpful in managing that. And there's a trick to quickly creating trigger conditions. So how you can quickly create a trigger condition for your flow is you can add a filter array action just temporarily, and you will find the 2, if you're looking to, like we're doing, 2 fields that don't equal, I'm going to select them from the trigger. So status choice value, this field is not equal to, from the trigger, the sysstatus SLT column. And then I'm going to go ahead and edit this in advanced mode. And what we want to do is just copy this and open it in Notepad. We'll paste that in Notepad. And then there are a few artifacts we want to remove here. So I'm going to remove the @ and the curly brace in front of this first trigger body output item. There's a closing curly brace I just removed, and then the opening curly brace and @ symbol for the second trigger body item and the closing curly brace. And that's it. We'll take all that, copy it, and we can post that directly into our trigger conditions. So we'll just copy all, paste, and that is a very simple way. You could, make this a lot more advanced, and you can have like way more trigger conditions as well. These are going to limit how often your flow runs. You really only want your flow to run when it's needed, and trigger conditions support that or help you to that end. So that's one of the key pieces here. Next, we're going to start initializing all of our variables. And so the first variable that we're initializing is this var status, and this is going to be the holding place for our status choice column value that we'll eventually use to update our SharePoint item. Next, very similarly is our sysstatus variable. This is going to update the sysstatus column at the end of our flow, and so we're just creating a place to hold it right now, and we'll update the value as the flow progresses on. Then we have an array type variable to hold our approval options. So approval options will be dynamic depending on who's receiving the approval. And this is just a place to hold them right now. It's going to be empty, and we'll set it later on. The next variable is a string for assigned to, and this is going to be the group or the role that's assigned the approval, either field tech, project manager, executive, whatever is defined in our workflow roles list here. Next will be our approver emails, and these are all just holding. We're not setting these at all. We're just creating the spaces to fill them in later. But this is going to hold the approver email, so who actually receives the email or the who actually receives the approval request. They could receive either an email or a Teams message, but this is going to hold their email, and so the system knows who to send the request to. And then the last variable we're going to initialize is going to hold our approval history multi-line text field. So that is what gets populated here in our approval history column. That's what we're going to create a space for in the flow right now, just to create that holding place for that multi-line text data. So we've initialized all of our variables. We haven't given them any information yet, but next we want to identify who are our approvers that are going to receive the approval and what are their options. So if we're switching on the status choice value of the record. So if the record is just created, its status choice value is going to be whatever the default is. And if I create a new item, you can see the default is pending field tech. So when a record's created, it's pending field tech. And so that would be the outcome of this switch. We'll look at pending field tech. This case equals pending field tech. Next, what we're going to do in this case is we will set our approval options to either pending project manager or canceled. And so what we're saying here is that when the field tech who's assigned this approval gets the approval, these will be the two options they can select, either pending project manager or canceled. And if they select pending project manager, a certain string of actions will occur. If they select canceled, another string of actions will occur. But here we're just setting up what those options could be for this approver. And then we are going to set our assigned to variable to field tech. And so this assigned to we're going to reference next in our flow. So in our next action after the switch, we're going to get our workflow roles items filtered on field tech. So this is filtering on our variable assigned to, and we just set it to field tech in this step here. So we're going to filter that and get all of the items that are filtered by field tech. So if we look at the workflow roles list, essentially what we're doing is we're filtering this by field tech. And this is the output of our get items. And so what we want to do next is capture the email record for all of the people identified in this column, in this people column. So that's what we will do next for each record from our get items output. And then for each person identified in the people column, since it's a multi-select person column, we have to loop through every single one of those people that are identified. We want to append their email to our var approver emails variable with a semicolon that separates them. So this is going to create a long string. If you have multiple people in your persons column or people column, this is going to create a string of emails that are semicolon separated in your variable, which you can then just reference in your outgoing approval. And that's exactly what we're doing next. We're starting and waiting for an approval. We are doing custom responses because we're setting our responses within our approval options variable up top. So now we're referencing it down here. You have to toggle this response options to allow for an array. So you have to toggle that, then you can reference your variable here. Keeping the title super simple for this demo. We just need a response. This is going to be assigned to our approver emails. So it's that semicolon separated string of emails. You could add, any type of details here needed. You could, reference dynamic content. You can make this details property very built out. Then we have an item link, which is going to link users directly to the SharePoint list item. And we're disabling reassignment in this demo. You could enable it. And when you enable reassignment, what that does is the approval will remain open even after reassignment. It won't recognize an output or an outcome until the person who has been reassigned the approval submits their response. Then this action of start and wait for an approval will proceed on to the next step. It'll recognize it's been responded to and it'll move forward. We disabled it for the demo, and then you could enable it as you rebuild this similar solution. So we start and wait for our approval. It's going to send it out. The flow is going to be sitting here waiting for them to respond. And then once they've responded, we are going to collect the response comments. So this is the formula that we're using in what is updating our approvals history multi-line text field. So this formula follows, this creates a consistent update ledger for your multi-line text approval history field. You have the formula in one area of your flow, and it just gets dynamically filled in with the approval response. So we have our approver display name, we have their outcome, we have their the current date and time that they received the approval. Then we put in their comments, and finally we wrap in the history from the triggered record. So the trigger body approval history. This is appending. We're just capturing what was already in this column, and we're putting it at the, and then we'll actually update within this flow. We'll update that record with all of this content and just keep growing that appended list of history. So that is setting up our approval history, and next we're going to look at the outcome of our approval. So now we can make some action occur based on what happened with our approval. So by default, we're assuming that the approval was either sent to one of these three groups: pending field tech, pending project manager, or pending executive. That's the default assumption outcome of any of our approvals. And so if that occurs, then we want to set our status, which is the status choice column, to the outcome of our approval. And that will update the choice column to, pending project manager or pending exec. It'll set it to whoever needs to next review this request. Then we want to set our system status column to the trigger body's status choice value. So this is what we're doing, is we're setting our system status to the previous status of the item, so that we get a different value in the system status column to the status choice column, and two, we get that ongoing ledger of this was the last status in the system status column, and this is the current status in the status choice column. So we're growing that ledger of change record for this SharePoint approval request item. And that's the default behavior. If the approval was either approved, which can only occur in this scenario, the only person who can actually approve the item is the executive. So the options for the executive is either they can send it back to the project manager, or they can approve the record. And if they do, then the flow is done. The record's been approved. So we want to set our var status and our var sys status to the same value. We want to make them equal so that our flow doesn't run again. We want to close the loop on this flow. And we set our var status to approved. Then we set our var sys status to our var status. So that just makes them the same value. And we do the exact same thing if it's been canceled. We just want to end the flow there. So we set our var status to canceled. Then we set our var sys status to our var status. So they just equal, they're the same value. Then once we have all of our variables in order, we can now update our SharePoint item. So it's very simple at this point. We just update the status choice value, we update the sys status value, and we update the approval history value with our variables. So the benefits of a system like this are, there are quite a few. First, there's fewer mouths to feed. There are fewer updates to make. Systems like approvals, departmental reviews, some kind of looping approval, or anything where you have to go forward and back between stages, there is a propensity to want to build in multiple update items or multiple areas where you connect to your SharePoint, and you make SharePoint actions like get items or update items or create records, and you can input them in the outcome of your approvals or something like that. But if you were to instead, in this manner, condense down how frequently you ping SharePoint or post to SharePoint, then you have fewer areas to adjust if the system needs new columns or needs to track new metrics or just naturally grows over time. You find that, you do have to maintain systems. And by reducing the frequency of inputs to your system, you reduce the areas in which you have to maintain. So if I were to now just, we need to add a new column to our state machine list, there's only one place in my flow that I have to adjust that new column, and that's here in the update item. Everywhere else is just, in flow data, just these variables. And compose actions are great as well, or filter arrays, or just, in flow actions that don't call an API to collect or update data. It really streamlines your the processing of the flow as well. It makes the flow run a lot smoother if you're not calling an API, if you're just working with data you've already collected, or formatting the data and prepping it for update. So another example of that is here. We have a get items. And what you could do if you needed to get not only the if you needed to get not only the field tech but also the executive, and you couldn't do an or filter query here or something, you needed to get both of them in different areas of your flow, you could, like we did with the trigger condition, you could do a filter array and just remove the filter of your get items and get everything from this workflow roles list. And then in your filter array, choose what you want to actually pick from your SharePoint get items. And so you don't have to have, get items that meet this condition and then duplicate this get items for another one, get items that meet that condition. You could just get everything that you need that, captures, within the you wouldn't want to get like a list that has 5,000 items or something. This would be like a settings list, but you could, do a one-step action to get all those items and then filter the outcome of that get items to get more refined filter of what you're actually going for. And this just, this is a lot more performant for Power Automate. Things are going to move a lot faster for you, and you just would have fewer connecting points to your backend data source. Another thing to consider that that we like to do at Inkworks as we're building solutions is more on the solution side. So if we're making changes and updates to our flows, one thing that I found in just even building this demo was every time that I would, save a draft or publish a change, it wasn't always immediately reflected that the change actually worked. And like here's an error. Let me go ahead and fix that error. We'll try publishing that again. I didn't feel confident that my changes were going to be reflected the next time that this flow was called. I wasn't sure that this flow was going to work in the way that I had just updated it to. And that's because, Power Automate doesn't always behave in the way you want. But to ensure that all your changes are, elevated to the very top, your changes are going to be the current production version of your system. Go ahead to your overview of your solution and export your solution. But before you do, publish it. And so doing the export publish operation, it gives you a new entry in the history record of your solution. So here it is, it's published. And now I'm going to go ahead and export it as unmanaged. This gives me a solution file, an unmanaged solution file of the solution that I could then deploy to any other environment and make modifications to, which is valuable in and of itself. But also we get another entry to the history record of the solution, which is just, this is helpful to see the activity occurring on your solution. So this is a pattern that would support your application lifecycle management, which is something that we discussed in the last webinar back in December. But this is a healthy pattern to take on as you're deploying more and more solutions. Looking back at our approval state machine rebuilds, one of the issues that can be seen with state machines is they're really difficult to test. A state machine in Nintex, it does allow you to transition between states, but they all exist within the context of the flow. They don't, Nintex knows the status that your record is in, but SharePoint doesn't. SharePoint doesn't know the state it's in, potentially. So it becomes difficult to test because if you want to test every single status in a state machine, you have to run that state machine through every single potential status in a single operation or in a single flow. And that could take a lot of time. If you have a approval process that needs 10 approvers sequentially, you have to go through each and every single one individually and hope that each one was built correctly and will process as intended. And if you break at stage 6, you have to start it all over again, go in Nintex, fix your flow at stage 6, and then test it again from stage 1. And that's really, really time consuming for testing. With this approach, we can kick off the review process, or that we can test any of these outgoing approval actions just by changing the status. As long as the status choice value does not equal the system status value, and then the status choice value equals the condition or the equals the user story that we want to test, then the flow will run. We don't have to wait for one before the other. We can just test them all individually, and that'll streamline your testing for sure. Another tip for testing your Power Automate flows is going to be this edit columns here. So this edit columns feature in your Power Automate flow run history is going to allow you to see some other detail from your SharePoint list that is captured in the trigger. So if I wanted to see like the sysstatus SLT value in my triggers, then I could add that column and I can see, okay, so this was the pending project manager. That was the last status. I could, use that to help me identify what flow run am I looking for, or what flow run should I test. Other columns you can see, you can see who the editor claims were, or you could see, a lot of other columns can come through here, and you can get some more information on the flow that ran. So that's really how we have helped many clients rebuild their state machines in Power Automate. And some of the key defining aspects that support this is reducing the amount of inputs to the data source. So if you are sending an approval, think of how can you make sure only one approval action is going out in your flow? How can you, set all of the parameters that you need to fill in for the start and wait for approval, set them up top, set them before you get to the approval action, and then fill them in with variables or the outputs of a compose or something like that. Similarly to your update item, reduce the amount of times you're updating an item in SharePoint and just have it as if it could be one step that updates an item and all of the updates are variables like this just reduces the amount of maintenance over time. And one more is, so you set your approval parameters up top and then you define the outcome down beneath before your update item. So you could have multiple more outcomes. Like this flow doesn't include sending an email to the creator notifying them that it's been approved or canceled or anything like that. But you could definitely build that into here just based on the output of that approval. So you could, have another response. Maybe the project manager has a different option that could be, rejected. And you could say, okay, if it's ever rejected, then I'll add this approval outcome here and I'll define what rejected looks like. And it only ever happens to the project manager. So, you can really build on this pattern. It's very dynamic, very scalable, and highly testable. So that is how we have done this in the past for a lot of our clients. And hopefully this was a helpful session for you and your organization. We thank you for taking the time to watch and listen, and please reach out with any questions or if you need any assistance in building state machines or rebuilding Nintex anything. Thank you all for watching.